The elevator doors were the kind that didn't rattle, didn't hum, didn't do anything but glide. And Camille Everly hated that about this building most of all. Everything about the Sterling Tower had been engineered to make a person feel small in the most polite way possible. Even the silence cost money. She checked her reflection in the brushed steel panel beside the call button. Charcoal suit, no jewelry except her late father's watch. Hair pulled back tight enough that nobody could accuse her of trying to look soft. She hadn't wanted to come. She had told her mother that 3 times over the phone the night before, and her mother had said the same thing she always said when Camille was about to do something she didn't want to do, and was going to do anyway. Then don't go looking like you're sorry about it. So she wasn't. If you're just joining me, welcome to the channel. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button, because where we're going tonight, you're going to want to be along for the whole ride. Now settle in, because this story starts with a woman who was never supposed to say no to a Sterling. The floor she stepped onto didn't feel like an office. It felt like a stage set for a play about wealth, all warm lighting and orchids flown in from somewhere that wasn't New York in February. A woman in a gray dress with a tablet met her at the doors and said, "Ms. Everly, this way, please," in a voice that had clearly said the same sentence to 5 other women already that evening. The room she was led into had floor-to-ceiling windows facing the East River, a long table set with tea nobody would drink, and 6 chairs arranged like a panel for a job Camille hadn't applied for. 5 women were already seated. She recognized the type immediately. The practiced stillness, the smiles held a beat too long, the way each of them sat like they'd rehearsed sitting. One of them, striking in emerald green, gave Camille a look that was somewhere between assessment and warning. At the head of the table sat an elderly woman with silver hair pinned in a low twist, and the kind of posture that made Camille sit up straighter without deciding to. This, she would learn, was Evelyn Sterling, and beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes on the window instead of the room, sat a man who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Elliot Sterling did not look up when Camille walked in. He looked up when she sat down without smoothing her skirt first, without arranging her hands, without doing any of the small choreography the other 5 women had performed. He looked up because the silence she brought into the room was different from theirs. Theirs was performance. Hers was patience running out. "Thank you all for coming," Evelyn said, and the interview began. The first woman spoke about her foundation, the wells she'd funded in villages she couldn't point to on a map. The second spoke about her fluency in Korean, demonstrating it unprompted, watching Elliot's face for a reaction he did not give. Audrey Sinclair, in the emerald dress, spoke last among the first 4, and she spoke like someone reading her own resume from memory. The board she sat on, the galas she chaired, the specific weight of understanding what it meant to marry into a family whose name was also a brand. Camille said nothing until Evelyn turned to her directly. "Ms. Everly, you've been very quiet." "I've been listening," Camille said. "And what have you concluded?" Camille looked around the table once, slowly, the way she looked at opposing counsel right before she dismantled their argument. "That this isn't an interview. It's an audit." Nobody laughed. Elliot almost did. She saw it happen and get swallowed, the corner of his mouth twitching before his jaw reasserted itself. "Why aren't you trying to impress anyone?" he asked. It was the first thing he'd said all evening, and every head at the table turned toward him like he'd fired a gun. "Because I wasn't aware this was a job interview," Camille said. A ripple of nervous laughter went around the room. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, not with anger, with interest, the specific interest of a woman who collected surprises the way other people collected antiques. The questions that followed got sharper. Would she relocate to Seoul? Would she step back from practicing law? Would she sign whatever the family's attorneys put in front of her without argument? Would the family always come first, above her own name, her own ambitions, her own mother's community center in Bed-Stuy that Camille had spent 6 years helping keep its doors open? She answered every question honestly, and every honest answer made the room colder. "I'd compromise for someone I loved," she said. "I'd move, I'd adjust, I'd bend. But I won't disappear. Not for a family, not for a fortune, not for anyone." Evelyn set down her teacup without drinking from it. "If my grandson asked you to choose between your career and him, what would you choose?" The room went still in the particular way rooms go still right before something gets said that can't be unsaid. Camille didn't look at Elliot. She looked at his grandmother. "I choose the life where he never asks me to make that choice." Nobody moved. She stood, buttoned her blazer, and said, "Thank you for your time," in the same tone she used to close a deposition, and walked out. She was 3 steps from the elevator when she heard a chair scrape back hard enough to be heard through a closed door. Here's where it gets interesting, because Camille thought she'd just ended the strangest night of her professional life. She had no idea she'd just started something the entire Sterling family would spend the next year trying to understand. If you've ever walked out of a room and had the whole world follow you, you know exactly the feeling I'm about to describe. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have walked out too, or would you have stayed and fought for the win? The elevator doors were closing when a hand caught them. Elliot Sterling stepped into the elevator like a man who had just decided something he wasn't going to explain to anyone, least of all himself. The doors slid shut behind him, sealing them into a box lined with mirrors, so that Camille was surrounded on every side by the reflection of a man who was supposed to be back at that table choosing a wife. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Neither should you," he said. And yet, she almost laughed. It escaped before she could stop it, a short, surprised sound, and something in his shoulders loosened when he heard it, like he'd been bracing for a slap and gotten something else instead. The elevator didn't move. Neither of them had pressed a button. "I'm not going back in there," she said. "I didn't ask you to." "Then why did you follow me?" He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he's fairly certain he's about to lose. "Because, in 4 years of these dinners, you're the first person who left instead of staying to win." The doors opened again before she could answer, and the whole family was standing there, Evelyn in front, flanked by Elliot's mother, 2 uncles, a cousin holding a clipboard nobody had asked for. Camille felt her stomach drop the way it did right before a judge overruled her. "You misunderstood something, Miss Everly," Evelyn said, and her voice, up close, was gentler than it had been at the table. "That room was never designed to find a woman who would obey my grandson." Camille said nothing. She was done being polite for an audience. "It was designed to find out who would survive us," Evelyn continued. "Every year we do this, and every year 5 women tell us exactly what we want to hear. You are the first one who told us the truth and then left anyway." "That doesn't sound like passing," Camille said. "That sounds like failing spectacularly." "You are the first woman who has ever passed," Evelyn said. The words sat strangely in the hallway, too large for the space. Camille looked from Evelyn to Elliot, who was watching his grandmother with an expression Camille couldn't yet read, somewhere between disbelief and dawning, dangerous hope. The others wanted something from him, Evelyn said. Position, comfort, a name that opens doors. You wanted nothing. Do you understand how rare that makes you in a family like ours? "I understand that it makes me a curiosity," Camille said, "not a candidate." She pressed the button for the lobby herself this time, and the doors began to close on 6 Sterlings standing in a hallway, watching a woman leave a fortune behind without so much as a backward glance. Elliot caught the door again. "Dinner," he said. "Not a proposal. Not an interview. Dinner, where nobody is allowed to ask you what you choose." "No," Camille said. "I'll ask again. You can ask as many times as you like. The answer's going to get more creative, not less firm." He smiled, an actual smile, unguarded for exactly as long as it took him to remember who was watching, and stepped back and let the doors close on her for good this time. She told herself, writing down 31 floors alone, that this was the last she'd see of the Sterling family. She was wrong within the week. He called it a business dinner. She called it a mistake she was making with her eyes open. Either way, she said yes the 3rd time he asked, mostly to make him stop, and found herself across a candlelit table from a man who ordered for himself instead of for her, who let a silence stretch without rushing to fill it, who listened to her explain a case she was working, an employment dispute, nothing glamorous, with the kind of attention most people reserved for things that could make them money. "You don't do this a lot," she said, halfway through the 2nd course. "Dinners. Real ones." "I do a great many dinners," he said. "I do almost none of them like this." "Like what?" "Without a purpose attached to it beforehand." Camille turned her wine glass slowly by the stem. There's always a purpose. You're a Sterling. There's a purpose, he admitted. I wanted to know why a woman would walk away from everything most people spend their whole lives chasing. And now you know. Now I have more questions than I started with, he said. Which is worse, for a man who's used to having answers handed to him. By the third dinner, their arguments had become the best part of the evening. About whether ambition and contentment could coexist, about whether inherited power was ever really earned, about a restaurant recommendation she disagreed with so thoroughly that he changed the reservation out of spite and then admitted, over dessert at the place she'd actually suggested, that she'd been right. He remembered things. The name of her paralegal. The fact that she took her coffee black until 4 p.m. and then switched to tea because caffeine after that hour left her staring at her ceiling. He never once mentioned money in a way that felt like a hand reaching for hers across the table, pulling her towards something she hadn't agreed to. She started, against every piece of professional advice she'd have given a client in her position, to like him. Then the first message arrived. Stay away from Elliot Sterling. No name. No number she recognized. She stared at it for a long moment in her office, then deleted it, because she was a grown woman who did not respond to anonymous warnings sent to scare her. The second one came 4 days later, and it had a photograph attached. It showed Elliot entering a private building on the Upper East Side, one hand at the small of a woman's back, her face turned away from the camera. Camille recognized the emerald dress before she recognized anything else. Audrey. She didn't call him. She didn't text him. She sat with the photograph open on her phone for 11 minutes, timing it without meaning to, watching the seconds climb, feeling something in her chest that she refused to name because naming it would mean admitting how much room he'd already taken up in there. When she finally did confront him, 3 days later, in his office, because she needed to see his face when she asked, he didn't deny meeting Audrey. He also didn't explain it. It isn't what it looks like, he said, which was, Camille thought, the single least convincing sentence in the English language. That's what people say right before it's exactly what it looks like. Camille. Don't. She held up a hand. You don't owe me an explanation. We're not. This isn't a relationship where you owe me anything. But wait. Here's the part that stopped her cold. Because as she turned to leave his office, she caught sight of a folder open on his desk, and the letterhead on it wasn't Sterling Group. It was her own law firm's, a firm she hadn't given Elliot Sterling a single reason to have documents from. What is that? She asked. Something shifted in his face, the careful blankness of a man deciding how much to say. Confidential company information has been leaking to the press for 6 weeks. Financial projections, merger conversations that were never supposed to leave this building. This morning, legal traced part of it to an account associated with your firm. The floor tilted slightly under Camille's feet. My firm. Not you, he said quickly. I don't think it's you. I know it isn't you. How reassuring, she said, though her mind had already moved past the insult and into the problem, because that was what 6 years of litigation had trained her to do. Feel the fear for exactly as long as it took to locate the facts underneath it. Show me. If you're the kind of person who likes puzzles, stick around, because this is where the story stops being a romance and starts being something else entirely. Also, quick question for the comments. Who do you think is leaking the information? I want to see your guesses before the reveal. They spent that night at his office going through documents, and it was there at 11 p.m., surrounded by financial statements and cold coffee, that Camille first saw him without the armor. He rolled up his sleeves. He argued with her about a clause in a contract and lost. And instead of getting cold about it the way she expected a Sterling to get cold about losing, he laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You're better at this than most of my board," like it was a compliment instead of a threat to his ego. That's a low bar, she said. It's a real one. 2 nights later, Evelyn summoned them both to the penthouse and proposed something Camille initially refused outright, a public relationship, staged for exactly as long as it took to smoke out whoever inside the family was feeding information to the press. A leak, Evelyn explained, that someone with access to the family's inner circle had been protecting for months. A public romance would draw the leaker into the open, force a mistake, give them a controlled environment to watch. Absolutely not, Camille said. "You be compensated for your time," Evelyn said, which was, Camille understood immediately, the single worst thing the woman could have said to her. "I'm a corporate attorney, not an actress for hire." "Then do it because it's the fastest way to protect the people your career already tells you to protect," Evelyn said, unbothered by the flash of fury in Camille's expression. "Someone in this family is willing to burn the company to the ground. If Elliot doesn't find them, the collapse will cost thousands of jobs before it costs my grandson his company." It was, infuriatingly, the argument that worked. They set rules, because Camille insisted on rules the way other people insisted on oxygen. No physical relationship. No pretending to make decisions for each other outside the performance. No lying to each other about anything real, even while lying to everyone else about everything visible. And absolutely, under no circumstances, no falling in love. Elliot agreed to all four, with a straight face that Camille, months later, would remember as the funniest thing he'd ever done without meaning to be funny. The fourth rule lasted 11 weeks. It broke, quietly, without either of them announcing it, the way ice breaks under weight nobody notices until they're already wet, at a gala in December, in a hallway outside a ballroom, full of people who thought they were watching a fairy tale. Camille had excused herself from a conversation with 3 board members' wives who kept asking, in increasingly specific ways, what it felt like to be the one, as though she were a prize someone had won rather than a person who'd shown up. Elliot found her leaning against the wall, arms crossed, jaw set in the exact expression she wore right before losing her temper in a courtroom. "Everyone in your world looks at me like I'm something they need to approve," she said, before he'd even asked. "I don't," he said. "Then what do you see?" He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the noise of the ballroom seemed to fall back behind a pane of glass. "Someone I don't want to lose." Neither of them moved. His hand found hers, not gripping, just resting there, like a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. She didn't pull away, not right away. And for 3 full seconds the fake relationship they'd built to catch a thief stopped being fake at all. Then Camille stepped back first. "We should get back inside," she said, and her voice wasn't quite steady, and they both pretended not to notice that it wasn't. Somewhere in that ballroom, a woman in an emerald dress watched them return separately through different doors and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has been paying very close attention, that the arrangement Evelyn Sterling had engineered had stopped being an arrangement at all. She was not the only one watching. Victoria Sterling had spent 30 years learning how to smile at people while quietly deciding how to remove them from her life. And she turned that smile on Camille the very first time they were introduced, at a dinner Camille had not wanted to attend and could not, given the family politics involved, refuse. "You're the attorney," Victoria said, in the tone people usually reserved for describing a stain. "I am." How resourceful of Evelyn, finding someone so practical. Camille had faced down partners at white shoe firms who tried to intimidate her with less finesse than that single word carried. She smiled back just as pleasantly. "I find practical gets more done than most other things people bring to a negotiating table." Victoria's eyes flicked briefly to something behind Camille's shoulder, a look Camille would only understand the significance of much later. And then she excused herself with a kind of grace that made the exit feel like a threat rather than a retreat. Within a week, Victoria had learned the name of the community center Camille's mother ran in Bed-Stuy. Within 2, a shell corporation Camille didn't immediately trace back to the Sterling family made an offer on the building. An offer well above market value. An offer designed to be too good to refuse and, once accepted, impossible to undo. Camille's mother called her in tears, not because she wanted to sell, but because the offer had come with a note implying the neighborhood's rezoning plans would make the building worthless within 2 years if she didn't take the deal now. Camille went to Victoria directly. "Leave my mother's building alone." "I have no idea what you're referring to." "You do. And I want you to hear this clearly, because I'm only going to say it once. You can threaten my career. You can threaten my reputation, my relationship, whatever else you think you have leverage over. But don't ever mistake my kindness for weakness. I have spent my entire career taking apart people who thought money made them untouchable." Something flickered behind Victoria's composure, not quite fear, but the beginning of a recalibration. The look of a woman realizing she had misjudged the size of the obstacle in front of her. "You should be careful, Ms. Everly," Victoria said finally. "Careful about what you assume you understand about this family. If you've ever dealt with someone who smiles while they're threatening you, you know exactly the chill in that sentence. Also, and I promise I'm not trying to distract you from the story, just a quick reminder. If you're finding this one gripping, drop a like, because it genuinely helps more people find the channel. And I've got 2 more twists coming that I don't think you'll see coming." The offer on the community center vanished within a week. Quietly, the way things vanished when someone with real power decided the cost of pursuing them had gotten too high. Camille never confirmed whether Elliot had intervened. She suspected he had. She never asked, because asking would have meant admitting how much it mattered to her that he would. In between the fear and the danger, there were ordinary nights, and Camille would later understand that those were the nights that mattered most, because they were the ones that had nothing to prove. There was the night Elliot showed up at her apartment with takeout from the wrong restaurant because he'd mixed up her order with his own assistants. And instead of apologizing his way out of it, he sat cross-legged on her living room floor and ate the wrong noodles with her, laughing every time she complained, until the complaining turned into something closer to contentment neither of them named out loud. There was the Sunday he came with her to her mother's community center, not for cameras, not for optics, but because Camille had mentioned, offhand, that the after-school program was short 2 volunteers, and he showed up in jeans nobody at Sterling Group had ever seen him wear, and spent 4 hours helping 11-year-olds with fractions, visibly more nervous in that room than he had ever looked across a boardroom table. "You were terrible at explaining decimals," Camille told him afterward, teasing. "I went to boarding schools in 3 countries, he said. Nobody ever asked me to make anything make sense to someone who genuinely didn't understand it yet. It's harder than negotiating a merger." "Welcome to my actual job," she said, and he laughed, and something in the way he looked at her afterward told Camille he meant it as a genuine compliment rather than a joke. Audrey, against every expectation Camille had walked in with, became something like an ally during those months. Hesitant at first, watching Camille with the wary respect of a woman who had spent her whole adult life being taught that other women were competition rather than company. It was Audrey who first warned Camille, quietly, over coffee neither of them had wanted to admit to needing, that Victoria had been asking pointed questions about the community center months before the buyout offer ever appeared. "She collects leverage," Audrey said, stirring a coffee she wasn't drinking. "It's not personal, particularly. It's just how she survives in this family. Find the thing someone can't afford to lose, and hold it where they can see it." "And what does she have on you?" Camille asked gently, because she'd noticed by then the particular tightness around Audrey's eyes whenever Victoria's name came up. Audrey didn't answer that day. It would take the scandal and the fear of losing everything before she finally did. Adrian, meanwhile, folded himself into every family gathering with a warmth that made him easy to like, and, Camille would later realize, easy to underestimate. He teased Elliot the way only a younger brother could, brought Camille small, thoughtful gifts, a case file organizer, a coffee blend he'd noticed her order twice, and made a show, always, of being delighted that his brother had finally found someone who challenged him instead of managing him. It was Camille's job, professionally, to notice when warmth curdled at the edges into something rehearsed. She would spend a long time afterward wishing she'd trusted that instinct sooner, and longer still forgiving herself for not having. The pressure built slowly enough that neither Camille nor Elliot registered it as pressure until it had already become crisis. Leaked documents grew more frequent. Reporters, who should never have had access to boardroom minutes, began publishing details that could only have come from inside the family's closest circle. Camille, reviewing patterns the way she reviewed discovery documents in a case, began to notice something that troubled her more than the leaks themselves. The timing of each leak lined up almost too neatly, with moments when Elliot and Camille's public relationship had generated its own headlines, as though someone were using the noise of their romance as cover. She raised it with Elliot on a night that should have been easy, dinner at his apartment, nothing performative about it. Just the 2 of them and a bottle of wine neither of them finished. "Someone's using us," she said. "Every leak lands within 48 hours of a story about the 2 of us. That's not a coincidence. That's cover." Elliot set down his glass slowly. You think whoever's doing this arranged our fake relationship to hide behind it. I think whoever's doing this didn't arrange it, Camille said. I think they noticed it happening and started exploiting the noise. Which means they're close enough to see the arrangement clearly. Close enough to be in the room when Evelyn proposed it. The list of people who had been in that room was short, and every name on it belonged to someone Elliot had trusted his entire life. The scandal broke on a Tuesday. Billionaire heir's new girlfriend accused of corporate espionage, the headline read, and underneath it, a photograph of Camille leaving Sterling Group's headquarters looking. In the still frame someone had selected specifically for this purpose. Guilty of something. The evidence had been planted well. A legal account linked to her firm. Timestamps that lined up with her documented visits to the building. An email thread doctored just enough to survive a glance, but not a forensic one. Camille understood, reading it in her office at 6 in the morning with her hands not quite steady around her coffee mug, that whoever had done this understood exactly how the media worked, and exactly how fast a reputation could be destroyed by a story that only had to be believed for 48 hours to do permanent damage. She expected Elliot to hesitate. 6 years of watching men in power protect their families over strangers had taught her exactly what to expect from a man like him when his company's reputation collided with hers. He called her before she'd finished her coffee. "I know you didn't do this," he said, no greeting, no preamble. "How do you know that?" Her voice cracked in a place she hated it cracking. "Because you could have taken everything from me the day I stepped into that elevator, Camille. You had every opportunity, every angle, every piece of leverage a person in your position could ask for. And instead you told my grandmother you'd rather live a life where I never had to choose. That's not the profile of a woman who plants evidence for a payday." She sat very still, phone pressed to her ear, in an office that suddenly felt too quiet. "I need you to help me find who did this," he said. "Not because I doubt you. Because you're the only person in this whole mess I trust enough to look at it clearly." They spent the next 6 weeks doing exactly that. Pulling financial records at midnight, cross-referencing board meeting attendance against leaked timestamps, building the kind of case Camille built for a living. Except this time the client was the man she had promised herself, 4 rules ago, she would not fall in love with. She broke down once at 2 in the morning, staring at a spreadsheet that refused to make sense. Exhaustion finally cracking through 6 weeks of composure she'd been holding together with sheer will. Elliot didn't say anything clever. He just crossed the room and held her, and she let him, because she was too tired to keep pretending she didn't want to be held by exactly this person. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered into his shoulder. "What wasn't?" She pulled back enough to look at him. "You." He didn't answer with words. He kissed her, slow, certain, nothing like the almost kiss in the hallway that had ended in retreat. And this time neither of them stepped back afterward, and neither of them pretended, not to each other and not to anyone watching, that what existed between them was still fake. Before the truth settled where it belonged, it detoured through nearly everyone Elliot loved. And each detour left a mark that didn't fully fade even after the accusation moved on. Suspicion touched Elliot's mother first, a woman who had spent decades absorbing Evelyn's disapproval for marrying outside the family's preferred circles, and who had every reason on paper to resent the empire that had never fully accepted her. Camille interviewed her gently, in a sitting room that still held photographs of Elliot as a boy, and came away convinced within 20 minutes that whatever resentment the woman carried, it had curdled into weariness long ago, not sabotage. "I stopped needing to burn this family down when I realized my son would do more good running it than I ever could tearing it apart," she told Camille. And there was enough exhausted honesty in it that Camille believed her immediately and felt, for the first time, a flicker of guilt about the suspicion itself. Suspicion moved next to an uncle whose stock sales had looked, on the surface, like a man preparing to profit from a coming collapse. He turned out to be quietly dying of a condition he hadn't told the family about yet, liquidating assets to protect his own children's inheritance from a diagnosis he wasn't ready to speak out loud. Camille sat with that discovery longer than she expected to, uncomfortable with how easily a private tragedy could look from the outside, exactly like a motive. "This is the part of the job nobody tells you about," she admitted to Elliot afterward. "Not the winning, the collateral damage of looking hard enough at people who didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't destroy anyone," Elliot said. You ask questions. He'll heal from that. If we'd guessed wrong and stopped looking, we wouldn't have found who actually did this. She held on to that the way she held on to most things he said in the quiet hours. Filed it away, useful, true, worth remembering the next time doubt crept in. The investigation, once it had momentum, moved faster than either of them expected. Camille's instincts, honed on years of discovery motions and forensic accounting, cracked the shell corporation that had made the offer on her mother's building, and the trail led somewhere Camille hadn't expected. Not to a rival company, not to a jealous board member, but to accounts with signing authority that traced directly back to the Sterling family board itself. Suspicion moved through the family like weather. First it settled on Elliot's mother, whose relationship with Evelyn had always carried an undercurrent of resentment Camille had noticed at every dinner she'd attended. Then it shifted to an uncle who'd been quietly liquidating Sterling stock for 8 months. Then, devastatingly, it settled on Audrey. Camille confronted her directly, in a parking garage after a board dinner, unwilling to let the accusation sit unspoken between them any longer. Audrey didn't deny it. She also didn't look like a woman confessing to a crime she'd committed willingly. Her hands shook. Her eyes, when they finally met Camille's, were wet in a way that had nothing to do with performance. "I knew," Audrey said. "I didn't create it. I want you to understand that. I was told what to do and what would happen to my family's business if I didn't." "Victoria," Camille said. It wasn't a question. Audrey nodded. Once, like the admission, cost her something physical. Here's where the story takes its darkest turn, and I want to warn you, if you've been enjoying the slow burn, buckle in, because from here the pace doesn't let up until the very end. If this is the kind of story you'd want in a longer, uninterrupted format, something you could listen to start to finish without any of these breaks, let me know down in the comments. I might have something coming for exactly that. But Victoria, it turned out, wasn't the architect. She was a tool being used by someone patient enough to let her think she was in control. Camille found a thread first, an offshore account linked to Victoria's transactions that led, after 3 more weeks of digging, to a second signatory whose name made her blood go cold when she finally saw it typed plainly on a wire transfer form. Marcus Sterling, Elliot's uncle, the man who had taught him to play chess, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral, the man Elliot trusted more than almost anyone alive. Marcus's plan, once exposed, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Engineer a slow-motion collapse of investor confidence, drive the stock down through a drip feed of leaked information and manufactured scandal, then swoop in through a series of shell entities to buy Sterling assets at a fraction of their worth. Victoria had been convinced, over years of careful manipulation, that she was reclaiming power for the family's traditional wing. Adrian, Elliot's younger half-brother, whose loyalty Camille had never once doubted, had been convinced of something else entirely, that Elliot's rise had cost him his own childhood, his own place in the family, and that tearing it down was less a betrayal than a correction. Adrian's confession, when it finally came, was the hardest for Elliot to hear. "You had everything," Adrian told him, in a room that had gone painfully quiet. The company, the name, even her. He didn't look at Camille when he said it, but everyone in the room understood exactly what he meant. "I just wanted something that was mine." Elliot said nothing for a long moment. "Then, you could have asked me. Instead, you let a man who doesn't care about either of us use you to burn down the only thing our father built." Camille watched something break and reset behind Elliot's eyes. The particular grief of realizing a wound has been in the family for longer than anyone admitted. Marcus, once exposed, didn't go quietly. He realized, with the specific cruelty of a cornered man, that Camille possessed the evidence that would end him: financial records, wire transfers, a paper trail she had built with the precision of someone who'd spent her whole career making sure paper trails couldn't be argued with. He also realized that removing her would remove the case along with her. She left work on a Thursday and didn't make it home. Elliot's phone rang at 11 that night. A video, no words, just Camille's face in poor lighting, silent, afraid, alive. A demand followed by text. The evidence, deleted everything, or she wouldn't come home at all. Come alone. If you've ever had your stomach drop out from under you reading a single sentence, you understand exactly what Elliot felt reading those 4 words. I'm not going to lie to you. This next part is intense. If you need a second before continuing, now's the time. He did not go alone. He couldn't have, even if some panicked, desperate part of him had wanted to. Because Camille, in the 11 minutes she'd had alone in a moving car before her phone was taken, had done what 6 years of practicing law had trained into her without her ever having to think about it. She'd left a trail. A single geotag photo sent to her own cloud storage before the phone died. A detail in the background of the kidnapping video. A specific stretch of exposed brick, a particular angle of window, that Camille had once mentioned to Elliot months earlier, over a dinner about nothing in particular, describing a building near the old freight yards her father used to point out on drives through Brooklyn. Elliot remembered. He remembered because he remembered everything she told him, the way he'd been remembering small details about her since the night she walked out of his family's marriage interview and changed the entire shape of his life without meaning to. The police traced it in under 2 hours. The rescue that followed was tense in the specific, breathless way real danger is tense. Not cinematic, not clean, a scramble through a half-renovated warehouse with Marcus cornered and desperate and Camille zip-tied to a chair with her jaw set in the same defiant line had held the night she walked out of a marriage interview worth more than most people would ever see. She was shaking when they found her. She was also, notably, already working her wrists against a restraint, because some things about a person don't change even under duress. Marcus was arrested within the hour. Camille was safe. But safety, it turned out, didn't erase what had happened. And in the weeks that followed, Elliot carried a guilt Camille had to work hard to talk him out of. "You didn't save me because you're a billionaire," she told him one night, both of them sitting on the floor of his apartment because neither of them had the energy to make it to a couch. "You saved me because you love me. Money didn't remember that building. You did." He held her hand like it was the only solid thing left in a year that had tried, more than once, to take everything from both of them. The scandal, once it broke publicly, broke completely. Marcus was prosecuted for fraud and conspiracy. His name stripped from every building and boardroom it had ever decorated. Adrian cooperated fully with investigators. And though the family's forgiveness of him would take years rather than months, Elliot chose, deliberately and publicly, not to sever him from the family the way tradition might have demanded. Victoria admitted her role before a private board hearing, her voice steady even as her carefully built reputation dissolved in real time. And though Camille never fully warmed to her, she recognized something in the older woman's willingness to face the consequences she'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Elliot didn't hide behind lawyers or public relations teams. He stood in front of cameras himself and accepted responsibility for the culture inside his own company that had allowed the betrayal to fester as long as it had. He restructured the board. He removed executives who had looked away rather than ask uncomfortable questions. He created an independent ethics office with actual teeth, staffed in part by 2 attorneys Camille personally recommended, and extended new protections to employees who had spent years afraid to report exactly the kind of internal abuse that had nearly cost the company everything. For the first time in his adult life, Elliot Sterling was leading because he had chosen to, not because his family had left him no other option. And still, even after all of it, after the arrests, the headlines, the slow rebuilding of a fractured company and a fractured family, Camille found herself facing a question she hadn't expected to be harder than any of it. Elliot asked her to marry him on an ordinary Tuesday, no cameras, no stage perfection. Just the 2 of them in her small apartment with takeout containers still open on the coffee table. And Camille, who had faced down billion-dollar corporations and kidnappers, and a woman who tried to buy her mother's building out from under her, found she couldn't immediately say yes. "I don't want to become another woman standing behind your name," she told him, honestly, because honesty was the only thing she had left to offer after a year like the one they'd survived. Elliot didn't argue with her, and he didn't try to talk her out of the fear. He just took her hand. "Then don't stand behind me," he said. "Stand beside me." He told her in the quiet after that he had spent his whole life surrounded by people who wanted him to be predictable, controllable, easy to arrange around a boardroom table like another asset. He didn't want a wife who obeyed him. He'd had a childhood full of people who obeyed, and none of them had ever once made him feel like himself. He wanted a partner who challenged him, who told him when he was wrong, who had once, in a room full of people evaluating her like a product, stood up and told the truth instead of performing for a fortune. Camille still didn't answer that night. She needed time, and for the first time in his life, Elliot Sterling gave someone all the time they needed without once trying to hurry them toward the answer he wanted. Evelyn found her 3 days later in the small garden behind the Sterling townhouse, and Camille braced herself, out of a full year's habit, for another test. Instead, Evelyn sat down beside her and apologized. "I spent my life believing that protecting a family meant controlling its future," the older woman said, looking out at nothing in particular. "Every marriage in this family, going back 3 generations, was arranged to protect something: money, alliances, a name that needed defending. I told myself it was love, eventually, if we were patient enough. I'm not sure I believed that even when I was young." She looked toward the house, where Elliot stood at a window, watching them without pretending not to. "You taught us that perhaps love means allowing people to choose their own future," Evelyn said. "I don't know when I forgot that. I'm grateful you reminded me before it was too late for him." She reached over and took Camille's hand, not the grip of a matriarch extending permission, but the hand of an old woman offering an apology she meant. "You have my blessing," Evelyn said, "not as a condition of anything, just as an apology for what that marriage interview asked of you before we understood who you were." Camille said yes to Elliot that night. If you've made it this far, thank you, genuinely, for sticking with this one all the way through the hardest parts. If this story moved you even a little, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling me which act hit you hardest, and stick around, because we're almost to the end, and I promise the ending is worth every twist it took to get here. Also, where in the world are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far these stories travel. They married 8 months later, on a spring afternoon warm enough to hold the ceremony half outdoors, in a garden strung with lights that hadn't yet been switched on when Camille walked out to meet him. The wedding braided 2 traditions instead of choosing between them: a paybeak ceremony in the morning, Camille bowing to Elliot's family in a hanbok the color of ripe plums, Evelyn tossing dates and chestnuts into her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady with emotion, and in the evening, Camille's. Mother's church choir filling the garden with a kind of gospel harmony that made even Elliot's most reserved relatives close their eyes and sway without meaning to. Camille walked down the aisle in a gown her mother had helped choose, simple with a Sterling family's taste, ran ornate, and Elliot, watching her walk toward him, did nothing to hide how visibly undone he was by the sight of her. A year earlier he would have died before letting 300 people watch him cry. That version of him, Camille thought, watching his face from 20 feet away, had already started disappearing the night she walked out of his family's marriage interview, and he'd chosen, for the first time in his adult life, to follow someone instead of being followed. Their vows weren't the traditional ones. They'd written them together over weeks, arguing good-naturedly about wording the way they argued about everything, and what emerged carried almost nothing about possession and almost everything about equality. "I will never ask you to become smaller so that I can feel bigger," Elliot said, his voice steady even though his hands, holding hers, were not. "And I will never ask you to choose between the family you came from and the family we are building," Camille answered. "I will only ever ask you to choose both the way I intend to." They married as the light went gold behind them, and the Sterling family, all of it, even Victoria, standing quietly near the back, having spent the better part of a year rebuilding something like integrity, one difficult conversation at a time, watched a woman who had once walked out of their penthouse become, entirely on her own terms, one of their own. Victoria found Camille near the dessert table late in the evening, when the dancing had thinned and the night had gone soft around the edges. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said, without preamble, in a voice that had none of its old sharpness left in it. "I spent a year deciding you were a threat to protect this family from. You turned out to be the only person who protected it better than I ever did." Camille studied her for a long moment, then extended her hand, not because the wound was fully healed, but because she understood, better than most, what it cost a proud woman to say those words out loud. "Welcome to the family," Camille said, and meant it. 1 year to the day after that wedding. The same penthouse that had hosted the marriage interview that started everything filled again with Sterling's, laughter carrying through rooms that had once felt, to Camille, like a courtroom dressed up as a party. Evelyn stood at the head of the table and announced, with a gleam in her eye that made Camille's stomach drop on instinct, that she intended to conduct another marriage interview. Camille went very still. Elliot, beside her, started laughing before his grandmother even finished the sentence. "For my great-nephews," Evelyn clarified, delighted at the panic she'd clearly engineered on purpose. "Not for either of you. Heaven help me, once was more than enough." The whole room dissolved into laughter, and Camille exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and leaned over to whisper to her husband, "If anyone at this table ever asks me another marriage interview question, I am walking straight out that door." "I'll follow you," Elliot said. She looked at him. The same look she'd given him in an elevator a year and a half earlier, when she hadn't yet let herself believe a man like him could be anything other than exactly what his family's fortune had made him. "You always do," she said. He kissed her forehead, right there in front of the whole laughing, imperfect, hard-won family they had built out of betrayal and evidence, and 1 very long year of choosing each other on purpose, again and again, long after either of them had stopped needing a reason to. Camille walked into the Sterling mansion that first night believing she was being asked to prove she was worthy of a billionaire. She left a year and a half later, having learned something the family itself had needed just as badly to learn, that the greatest love isn't the one that hands you everything money can buy. It's the one that hands you the freedom to remain, through every twist and every betrayal and every quiet Tuesday afterward, completely and unapologetically yourself. If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments which moment hit hardest, the elevator, the kidnapping, or that vow at the altar. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and if you've been wondering about that extended version I mentioned earlier, the one with scenes that don't make it into the YouTube cut, keep an eye on the links below. I don't want to give away too much. Thank you for spending this time with me and with Camille and Elliot. I'll see you in the next one.